So I know what you're thinking. I don't recall Tom being that tall, or bald, or muscular. So I'm not Tom. I'm hoping before the disappointment sets in, I can get a wedge into your mind and get you to take a journey with me. Maybe not a mystery ship, but something like that. And we can hopefully all learn something together. So if you'll indulge me, I have an 11:11 story to tell you. All right, magic. So when I found out I was going to be preaching about 3 weeks ago, almost immediately, for some reason, thought of this interesting and enigmatic character here, historical character. And I knew that's where I wanted my sermon to go, even though I wasn't sure at the time how it would all fit together. So I keep this little notebook by my bed where I write down little, ideas in case I need them later. So if I get an idea, I'll write it down. I'll just stick it in there. So maybe years ago, I don't know how long ago, I'd written down this single phrase on a piece of paper, Diogenes lantern, and I stuck it in my notebook for later. So every now and then I would come across it and look at it a few minutes and put it back. Anyway, that was on my mind when I started thinking about what I wanted to talk about, and so I wrote a sermon or a message, and this is it. And when it was mostly finished, and I was just letting my mind kind of wander, and I finally came up with the question, why in the world did I choose Diogenes as a topic, and why did I even write it down in the first place? And then I remembered, it kind of hit me in a flash where I got the idea and how I'd originally thought about it. So several years ago in one of my classes, I had a student who was an artist. And sometimes after class, he would show me the stuff he was working on, probably when he wasn't listening to the class. But anyway, that's cool. But he would show me stuff he was working on. And then after he graduated, he would sometimes send me emails with his stuff, or he would post it on Facebook and tag me, and I'd look at his stuff, and it was really cool. But he tagged me in this picture that he had drawn. And I thought it was really cool. It kind of spoke to me. I loved the picture. And it got me really interested in why he painted it and what it was saying. And so I went and did some research on it. I found out it's Diogenes. This is Diogenes, the philosopher, and his lantern sticking up in your face there. So I got on the internet. I started doing some research in philosophy and what Diogenes stood for. And that's why I stuck it in my notebook originally. So had this student not shown me this particular art piece, I would not be giving this message today. So there's a little, as I get older, it seems like there's more of these coincidences in life, or maybe I'm just noticing them more, but I think that's really cool how that all fits together, and we talk about that in here a lot, the Spirit moving and how things seem to all be connected. And so anyway, this is Diogenes' Lantern by Hamilton Jordan, an ex-student of mine, and his tag is on it if you wanted to look at some more of his work, and he's got some really interesting, good stuff. This is his Instagram tag. I think you can see how challenged I am, but I think it's his Instagram tag, or you can also just Google him if you were interested in more of his art. But anyway, I really appreciate him sending this to me and giving me permission to show it and all of that. So, Diogenes. Diogenes was a near contemporary of Socrates. There's a name everyone's heard. Socrates supposedly drank the hemlock and died when Diogenes was about 13 years old, but they lived in totally different worlds. When Diogenes was a really young man, probably a teenager, he was kicked out of his hometown for defacing currency, which was probably a political act. They would stamp out Alexander the Great's picture, protesting sort of his imperialism. So anyway, he got kicked out. So banished, I think is the word. Being banished back then meant you had to leave or you would get killed. And they took everything you had, all of your property, all of your money, your clothes, everything you had to leave alone. So he left with just the shirt on his back, equivalent of a shirt back then. And he decided that I have got nothing to lose. I've always wanted to go to Athens. So he walked all the way to Athens, which was about halfway across modern-day Turkey of a walk for him. So anyway, so he decided to remake his life as a philosopher. So he had heard that Antisthenes, a student of Socrates, was still around and still running Socrates' philosophy school. So he wanted Antisthenes to take him as a student. So he found him. He started following Antisthenes, hard to say these words, started following him around, or he'd hang out at the door of the philosophy school, and Antisthenes would not take him as a student. Didn't see that he had much promise. Wouldn't take him as a student. So Antisthenes started hitting him with a stick when he showed up. hit him with a stick. To which Diogenes replied, "You will find no wood hard enough to keep me away, so long as I believe you have something to say," supposedly. So eventually, Antisthenes relented, and that began Diogenes' training as a philosophy student. So why are we talking about Diogenes? Okay, so here's why. As Diogenes grew as a philosopher, he came to a realization. You might say he came to a new idea. Diogenes had an idea that led to two new branches in philosophy that you still have to put up with if you take a philosophy class. Cynicism and Stoicism. You may have heard of some of those if you've ever taken a philosophy class. He came to the conclusion that no philosophy is valid unless you could actually live it. So he was very frustrated with philosophers just making abstract arguments for things. He believed that if you can't live it, it really doesn't matter. And he gave that a lot of thought, and that was his original position. So he thought that as soon as a person knows what is right and true, that person should change their life immediately in the direction of that truth. Nothing should stop them. And if someone had an honest and true answer to a question you asked them, an inquiry, you should give a 100% non-sugar-coated answer to whatever it was they asked. So Diogenes dedicated the rest of his life to living truth. That was kind of his thing. And he died a very old man. He lived to 89. So pretty good for back then, for the healthcare of Athens, I'm sure. So what did he do exactly? What did his conclusions lead him to? So what did he feel that he had to give up? So first he gave up his lodging when he was pretty young. He stopped living in houses and basically became voluntarily homeless. Then he gave up his clothes, and he took to only wearing, I guess the modern equivalent is underwear. It would have been a tunic back then, but anyway, so he gave away his clothing. He only had his tunic to wear, and that was only so he wouldn't be arrested. He gave away all his money, and the only thing he kept was a cup, because he figured he had to drink water or he would die within 3 days, so he needed a cup to put it into the cisterns or to catch rainwater. But one day he saw a boy drinking out of a cistern with his hands, and he thought, I don't need a cup. That's ostentatious. So he gave his cup away, and he started only, so he's basically naked, and he's drinking with his hands. Okay, so he took up residence eventually in Athens at the city gate in an abandoned cask that someone had rolled by the city gate of Athens. I don't know if you can see this picture. This is obviously an artist's conception, but this is Diogenes sitting in his cask by the gates of Athens. So he owned only one thing I didn't tell you about. I guess I've already ruined the surprise. He owned a lantern. So his favorite ploy was to stick it in a passerby's face and say, "Are you an honest man?" So they had to put up with that as they're walking into Athens. In other words, you claim to stand for things, but do you really? His fame spread, and eventually it became a thing, to go visit Diogenes and see what he had to say. He was harsh. So there you go. But people would travel to Athens just to see Diogenes and hoping he'd say something really profound that they could take with them, maybe change their life, whatever. So he owned no writing utensils or paper or anything, the equivalent of paper, papyrus, whatever they used. He eventually dictated about 10 books or so, we think, from history. And he dictated them to devotees and to budding philosophers, and that's the only reason we know anything about him at all. True story. Diogenes was eventually actually visited, true story, by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great had heard of him and decided to take his entourage up to the gates of Athens and actually ask Diogenes some questions. And so he approached his cask and asked him and told him that he'd heard of his fame. And Alexander asked Diogenes, "Hey, is there anything I can do for you?" To which Diogenes replied, "Yeah, you can stop standing in my light." Keep in mind that you could be put to death just for making eye contact with Alexander. So that was a pretty bold statement. It was, obviously he'd honed his art of saying what he wanted to say. So history records, it could have been a bad moment, but history records that Alexander actually laughed and took a step back, having not being accustomed to being spoken to in that way. And he said to Diogenes, "If I were not Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes." To which Diogenes replied, "If I were not Diogenes, I would want to be Diogenes. So what was it that Diogenes believed that was so compelling? This is it in a nutshell. So number one, the only city, he had this idea. He invented a word that came into the Greek language and eventually into English because of Diogenes and his fame, and that word is cosmopolitan. At the time, it was an extremely radical idea. It was this idea that he rejected the city-state of Athens as being superior to any other state, and he felt like the only city that matters is the city of man, that we're all the same species, we should try to relate to one another as equals, and that this idea of having tribes and states was just an impediment, really, to our progress. So that was one of the things he believed. Secondly, he really was hard, as you can tell from his position and the way he lived, he was very hard on society. He felt like society's restrictions really made people dishonest. They couldn't say what they wanted to say because of either the subtle psychological threat of society or just because something's illegal to do or say. And that was a really holding humanity back also. Sort of the tendency to fall back on what culture says is normal and desirable. 3, the proof, we've already gone over this one, but behavior is the proof of belief. So he's more interested in what you do than what you have to say about what you believe. What do you do? 4, total honesty. And then 5, total personal responsibility. In other words, you can't blame anyone else for what's happening to you. You decide what you believe and what you do. And to his credit, he lived that. He didn't ask anyone for anything. So one has to wonder, I think, what Diogenes would think of our modern world. I think it's the question that it begs the question. Or maybe our little corner of the world here, Methodist Church, 1111. You know, the United Methodist Church has a long history of holding up a lantern to the face of culture. How close are we to justice now? I think it's a worthy question to ask. How close are we to the state where we see all people as inhabitants of one city, the city of man? I'd like to go ahead and call the band back up. It's okay. Brad, okay. Okay, so the next slide. This is a little quick history. Obviously, this could be an entire course in college, I guess. So this is a history of sort of some of the times that the United Methodist Church in history so far has held up a lantern to culture and has resisted the culture and has been a force for change. And John Wesley was one of the first preachers anywhere to license a woman to preach. Sarah Crosby in 1761. In 1786, John Wesley circulated a memo of really historical importance, saying that the verse in the Bible that says submissive to husbands does not allow husbands, lordship over their wives, or does not give them the right to mistreat them. It's not to be interpreted in that way. That's a false and ignoble way to look at that scripture. Sojourner Truth, the reformer, became a freelance Methodist pastor and was ordained in 1843. In 1845, the church split over slavery, mainly because there were Methodists who wouldn't compromise on the issue. Sound familiar? Okay. And we got back together in 1939. Took a long time, but we did get back together. Not all churches did. I'm not saying any names. But not all churches did get back together over that. 1908 was a really good year for Methodists. The Social Creed came out. This is just a summary of some of the things that were in writing in the Methodist Book of Discipline that you can look this up, Google it yourself, but here's a summary. Equal rights for all races, rights of unions to assemble freely, total abolition of child labor, safe working conditions in factories, a mandatory weekend for laborers, and a mandatory minimum wage at the highest level a business can afford. The Methodist position on labor in 1908, if you can imagine what a controversial, it's still controversial, but in 1908, how controversial that would be. Okay, in 1924, American Church ordains women across the board, North and South. In 1972, the church declares homosexuals are people of sacred worth and deserve equal rights. Of course, we hear that in the context of what's going on now, lately, and probably in a negative light mostly. But at the time, it was a pretty radical statement because they were taking a stand for civil rights for homosexuals when hardly anyone else was. In 1980, the first female bishop was ordained, and so on and so forth. So in each of these cases, the church stood with those, the Methodist Church stood with those who saw the world as a city for everyone. They held up a lantern to the delusions of culture and the delusions of tradition. And the truth is, I think, the world is a better place because of Methodists and their convictions and their willingness to change when the scientific evidence and the promptings of the Spirit become apparent. When oneness breaks through, we have changed in the past. So I think this is good news. I think this is Godspell. It's good news because it shows we have the power to change the world if we have the courage of someone like Diogenes. We can be part of the solution. We can be inhabitants of the only city there is. Beautiful city of man. Amen.